The trouble started with a single sentence, spoken with more courage than certainty. "I need a fake husband for 30 days." The woman who said it stood on a dusty boardwalk in a town that still smelled of gunpowder and fresh paint, a place not long pulled from the wilderness. The air was dry, restless, as if it carried the memory of battles fought in the hills not far beyond. Folks on the street slowed their steps, half pretending not to listen, though every ear was straining. For a moment, even the wind seemed to. Still, it wasn't the kind of request a lady made in public, and certainly not to the man she had chosen. He was Apache tall, quiet, eyes that carried 1,000 untold stories. His hair hung loose to his shoulders, black as crow feathers, and he moved with the kind of patience that came from a life closer to the land than to towns or rules. Nobody in that town could recall hearing his voice raised, but they all knew. He was not one to cross. Children stared, women whispered, men tugged at their hats. To ask him of all people, in that way, was daring enough to stir the whole settlement like a stick through still water. The woman's name wasn't spoken often. In the saloon or at the mercantile, she carried herself with dignity that made folks cautious in how they talked about her. She wasn't born to the West. Her accent and manner gave away a life once gentler, far from the cracked earth and wild winds. Still, she had grit, enough to survive out here when many couldn't. The loss of her family in the fever 2 years back had left her with nothing but the land her late husband had staked. But land out here drew trouble. Too many wanted it, and too few cared about fairness. That was why she needed the arrangement. 30 days. Just long enough to sign the papers, fend off the vultures circling her ranch, and show the law that she wasn't alone. A widow might be pushed, cheated, run clean out of her own home. But a woman with a husband, even a husband in name, only that was another matter. Respect, or at least hesitation, could be bought with such a shield. What she hadn't expected was that the Apache would pause, let the silence stretch, and then answer with nothing more than a small nod. Not a question, not a price, just agreement. That simple gesture unsettled her more than any refusal might have, because it meant he was willing, and nobody knew why. In the days that followed, the town hummed with speculation. Some swore he had debts to settle. Others believed he saw some advantage hidden in her land. A few muttered darker things, warnings about mixing bloodlines, curses that came of pacts between people who walked different paths. But none of them dared say such words in front of him. They saved them for quiet corners, candlelit whispers. Life in that old American town had always been a fragile balance. Settlers clung to their small claims, ranchers guarded cattle trails, merchants eyed every coin, and beyond the town limits lay the wild untamed, watching, patient. The railroad tracks stretched eastward like a promise but hadn't yet reached. Far enough to soften the edges of this place. Folks still solved disputes with revolvers more often than lawyers, and justice came late if it came at all. Against that backdrop, her bold plan seemed less foolish than it sounded. It was survival in a land that respected only strength, and strength came in many forms. The days ticked by, and her marriage became the talk of the town. He stayed mostly silent, watching, learning, as if weighing each soul he encountered. She, on the other hand, grew restless. Each morning she woke with the same thought. Had she made a mistake? She had wanted safety, not entanglement. And yet, with every passing hour, it seemed the ground beneath her was shifting in ways she hadn't foreseen. He was not a man who smiled easily, but he had a way of seeing her, not just her words, but her fears, her doubts, the burden she carried, since death had taken everything she knew. Sometimes, when they crossed paths at the corral or shared a quiet meal, she wondered if he understood her better than she dared to admit. And that frightened her most of all. It wasn't long before trouble began to show its face. A group of riders lingered near her fence line, their eyes measuring more than just the cattle. A rival rancher, slick in speech and backed by guns, made his interest plain. He wanted the land, and he didn't care what he had to do to get it. She had counted on her husband to scare off such men, but the truth was more complicated. His presence alone wasn't enough. It drew curiosity, suspicion, and danger of its own. Whispers reached her ears that the deal she had struck was stirring old grudges. Some said the Apache had kin in the hills, others said he had enemies who would follow him to the grave. And here she was, bound to him by her own desperate bargain. She tried to tell herself it was only for 30 days. Just 30 days, and then she would be free. But in her heart she already sensed the truth. Nothing about this would end clean. Nights grew colder, the days shorter. Each dawn carried with it a new question. Could she trust the man she had pulled into her life, or had she invited something she could not control? The town watched, waiting for the storm they knew was coming. She felt it too, like the tremble of the earth before thunder rolls across the sky. And on the 30th day, when the papers were meant to be signed and the bargain concluded, something happened that no one in town could have imagined. The 30th day arrived like a storm hidden behind calm skies. For weeks the town had buzzed with quiet talk about the woman and the Apache, every glance or gesture between them fueling a new tale. Some said they hardly spoke at all, others swore they had seen them walking together at dusk as if sharing secrets no one else could hear. What no one denied was that something had changed. The air itself seemed charged whenever they were near each other, as though fate had stepped into the dusty streets and refused to leave. She had told herself every morning that it was only temporary. 30 days and no more. 30 days of appearances, of playing the part of a wife so her land could remain hers and not fall into the hands of men who measured life by profit alone. But somewhere along the way, the lines between pretense and truth blurred. It was not that she loved him, or even fully trusted him, but he had become a constant in a world where nothing felt steady. And she had grown accustomed to the quiet strength of his presence. Still, beneath every routine moment lingered unease. The rival rancher had not given up. He rode past her property more often, leaving dust clouds that settled over her fence like warnings. His men leaned on saloon walls, watching, waiting, always near enough to remind her that the danger had not passed. The sheriff, worn down and wary of trouble, offered little more than muttered advice to keep her head low. But she knew too well that in a land like this, silence invited wolves closer. The Apache spoke little, but she began to notice the way his eyes followed those riders, sharp and calculating. He moved around her ranch as though it were his own, checking gates, walking the fence line, and sometimes vanishing into the hills without explanation. At first she thought he did these things out of habit, a man used to living with caution. But one night, when the firelight flickered against his face, she asked him straight why he stayed even when their agreement was almost done. He did not answer in words. Instead, he looked at her with such steady calm that she felt the weight of it in her chest, heavier than any promise. Life in that old town was a fragile thing. Every family that had come west carried scars from the journey. Some had lost children to fever, others had buried kin along the wagon trails, and all of them lived with the fear that tomorrow might bring drought, stampede, or gunfire. Yet beneath the hardship lay an unyielding hunger to endure. The woman saw it in the tired faces at the mercantile, in the calloused hands of men who worked the stockyards, and in her own reflection when she washed away the dust of another day. This land tested everyone, and those who stayed did not stay. Unchanged, her own transformation had come without her noticing. Once she had been the wife of a man who dreamed of building a future under the wide sky. She had believed in that dream, believed that a patch of earth could be enough to build a life. When fever took him, she thought the dream had died with him. But standing alone against the schemes of men who saw her as weak, she found a resolve she never knew she carried. Asking the Apache for help had been her boldest act yet, born of desperation but carried forward by the same spirit that had driven her west in the first place. The townsfolk, for all their gossip, began to treat her differently. Women who once pitied her now nodded with something closer to respect. Men who once thought her easy to pressure now weighed their words more carefully. Still, behind polite smiles, she caught glimpses of suspicion. People feared what they did not understand, and the Apache was a figure they understood least of all. Stories about him wound through the streets like dry weeds, that he had once fought alongside warriors against soldiers, that he had seen visions in the desert, that he carried scars no one else could see. None of it was spoken to his face, and none of it could be proven, yet the whispers grew louder as the end of the 30 days approached. She tried to push those doubts aside, but unease crept in when she was alone at night. What did she truly know about him? Why had he agreed without question? Each time she asked herself, no answer came. And yet she could not deny the way his presence kept the fear at bay. Even when riders came too close to her corral, even when the rancher's men spat warnings in her direction, she felt safer knowing the Apache was near. The days leading to the 30th ticked by with unsettling calm. The rival rancher disappeared from town for several nights, and though that absence brought temporary relief, it also left her wondering what he was planning. The Apache, too, grew more watchful, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark, his face unreadable. She stopped asking where he went, because some part of her feared the answer. When the sun rose on the day their bargain was meant to end, the town seemed to hold its breath. She dressed with care, choosing the same dark blue dress she had worn the day she struck the deal. It had been meant as armor then, a sign of dignity. Now, as she stood before the mirror, it felt like a reminder of how far she had come and how uncertain the road ahead remained. She walked to the courthouse with her head high, though her heart pounded. People stepped aside as she passed, their eyes following, their silence heavier than words. The Apache was already waiting at the steps, standing tall and still as though carved from the stone itself. For the briefest moment, she wondered if he felt the same knot of tension she carried. But if he did, he gave no sign. Inside, the papers lay ready. 30 days had been promised. 30 days had been endured. All she had to do was sign, and the matter would be closed. She could return to her life as it had been before, alone but secure, her land safe, her freedom intact. That had been the plan from the beginning. Yet as she reached for the pen, a sound outside shattered the stillness. Hooves striking hard against the dirt, too many to be chance riders passing through. Shouts followed, sharp and commanding, and the courthouse walls seemed to tremble with the force of it. The judge froze mid-sentence, clerks exchanged fearful glances, and every soul inside knew before stepping to the window that trouble had come calling. She turned toward the door, hand still hovering over the paper. The Apache's eyes met hers, steady, unblinking, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. In that silence, she understood one thing with certainty: whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. And when the doors finally swung open, what stood on the other side was nothing the town had ever expected. The doors flew wide and sun flooded the room. The rival rancher stepped in first, boots loud on the plank floor, hat tipped so low his eyes were two dark slits. Behind him came a man in a wool coat too heavy for the season and a small iron seal hanging from a chain. A land agent. A third man followed with a satchel and a rolled map, the kind that smelled of ink and power. 2 riders waited outside with rifles laid across their laps, not pointed, but easy to lift. Nobody breathed until the judge cleared his throat and tried to Pretend this was routine business. The man with the seal spoke for all of them. He said the government had new surveys. He said the cattle trail would be widened into a freight road now that the railroad was moving closer. He said her homestead patent overlapped a right-of-way that did not exist on paper a month earlier, but was now stamped and signed. He said there had been complaints about trespass and fencing. He said the court would need to review everything before the judge could file new deeds. He did not look at the Apache. He did not look at the woman longer than he had to. The rancher finally lifted his chin and smiled without warmth. He said he had always been a friend to order. He said he would be happy to hold the land in trust while the court sorted matters. He said the woman had been misled by a temporary arrangement and that such arrangements had a way of confusing weak minds. At that, the Apache shifted just enough to quiet the room again. The rancher took a step back, hands open, as if to show. He meant no insult. Everyone heard the insult anyway. The judge fumbled with papers, sweat shining along his hairline. The clerk brought out an older ledger that smelled of dust and years. The woman watched the men move around her life as if it were a crate of goods to be tallied. She felt the old grief rise like heat. She had buried a husband on this land. She had bled and worked and prayed for rain on this land. Now it was a chessboard to men who never mended a fence post with their hands. She could not trust her voice, so she said nothing at all. The sheriff stood near the back with a slow patience that came from seeing too many seasons of the same fight. One set of papers against another, one story against another. He gave the woman a look that said he could not stop a storm that came in the language of stamped approvals and ink. Then he looked at the Apache and gave a second look that said storms did not always respect paperwork. The land decided its own truth sooner or later. He moved to the door and told the writers outside to keep their hands light. He said it twice. The TAS agent spread his map on the judge's desk. Lines crisscrossed like scars. There was the creek that cut along the edge of her pasture. There was the spring that never ran dry, even in the worst August. There was her boundary, squared and solid in the old record, and then the new right-of-way slid across it like a blade. The agent tapped one spot with a blunt finger. He said, a spur line might pass there if things went well. He said progress had a timetable. He said the town would prosper once freight rolled through in earnest. He never said what happened to the people whose lives lay under those lines. The Apache did not step close to the desk. He stood where he was and spoke 5 calm words to the woman. She nodded, unsure what she had agreed to, yet the words steadied her more than any law could. He asked the judge if the woman could review the papers at home before signing anything. The judge hesitated, then said the request seemed fair. The agent pursed his lips but did not argue. The rancher tilted his head like a hawk that missed. A mouse by an inch, they left in a hush that held even once they were outside in the hot day. The riders watched them mount up and did nothing more. People on the street pretended to continue with their errands, only now their errands had moved them exactly where they could see everything. The woman felt the weight of every eye as if it were a hand. The Apache looked only at the hills. He had come down from that horizon the first day she asked for help, and she knew now that he still belonged to it no matter what papers men signed. By late afternoon, the courthouse drama had become the town's new weather. The saloon filled early. Cards slapped on wood, but no one laughed much. The owner polished glasses until his hands hurt and kept one ear on the piano and the other on a quiet corner where the rancher talked with a stranger in a brown coat. Telegraph office clacked steady messages, and the operator caught a phrase that made her sit up taller. Talk of a special freight car. Talk of rails stacked near the river bend and guards to watch them. She wrote the message twice to be sure, then locked the slip in her drawer. At the mercantile, the widow who ran the counter watched 2 of the rancher's men buy coils of wire and a sack of feed they did not need. She made change slow and noted. The way they glanced at the shelf where the rifle cartridges sat. A school teacher who came in for chalk asked if the woman from the homestead had passed through. "Not today," the widow said. The teacher nodded and said she had been reading up on homestead law. She said water rights were older than the newest survey if a family could show use. She said she would keep reading by lamplight. She did not say she was afraid, but she was. The Apache did not go to the saloon or the telegraph office. He walked the fence line until the sun slowed, checking posts and tracks in the dust. He found a hoof print near the creek that did not match any of the horses. He knew. He found where the wire had been tugged but not broken. He bent and held his palm over the earth and sensed how long ago the wait had passed. When he returned to the house, the woman was at the table with the agent's map and her old deeds spread side by side. She had lit a single lamp. He told her what he had seen without drama. She nodded and pushed the map toward him. They studied it together. The lines had force, but so did the land. A spring sat under a rocky shelf where cottonwoods grew tall. Farther north, the creek carved a small draw where cattle liked to stand in the shade. If the spur were to cross there, a cut would be needed. A loud one. The woman said the noise would send her herd into panic for weeks. The Apache said noise could be useful if the time was right. She did not ask what he meant. She wanted to. Instead, she said she would ride to the telegraph office at dawn and wire the territorial office in the capital. The judge might hesitate, but distance could be a friend. The boy from the livery came after dark, hat in hand, eyes big as silver dollars. His grandmother was sick again, he said, and the Apache knew herbs that helped. The woman handed the map back to the satchel and said she would manage the house alone. The Apache took the boy and went out into the cool night. He walked past the corral and paused at the barn door that stood an inch open. He closed it without a sound, then drew the boy on and disappeared into the black. The barn door eased open again within the hour. A dark shape slipped inside and the sharp scent of oil followed it. A second shape stood watch near the cottonwoods. A match flared and died. A second match caught with a tremble. The watcher shifted, anxious to be gone. At that moment, a fourth figure rose from the hayloft and dropped like a stone. The sheriff hit the ground hard, knocked the match from the man's hand, and pressed a knee into his back. He had been waiting there long enough to listen to mice settle and to pray the hay would not go up by mistake. He bound the man's wrists with a leather strap and motioned the other shape inside where the lamplight could show a face. The partner threw up his hands and begged to be taken anywhere else. The sheriff hauled them both to town without a word. By morning, the saloon had a new story. The sheriff had caught two of the ranchers' hands near a barn that might have burned. The ranchers said they had acted on their own. He said he would fire them at once. He gave the sheriff a hard smile that said he expected to be believed. The sheriff did not argue. He just bought a cup of coffee and sipped it slow enough to think through what came next. The woman sent a wire to the capital as planned. The operator took the message and then slid another slip of paper across the counter. A warning. The special freight car would arrive before the week was out. The operator whispered that she had family who worked the rail line and did not trust the foreman who now rode with the rancher at odd hours. The woman thanked her and folded the warning inside her shawl. She rode home fast, speaking aloud to the wind as if it could carry her words to the Apache wherever he was in the hills. Subplots grew roots in the hard ground. The widow at the mercantile gathered women who had lost as much as the woman had lost. They shared food and kept watch on riders who changed saddles too often. The school teacher pieced laws into sense and went to the judge with a calm voice and clear eyes. The blacksmith, a veteran of other wars, sharpened tools for every small ranch that could pay him and more than a few that could not. The saloon owner took a quiet stand no one saw. He refused to sell whiskey to men who left the table when the rancher entered the room. He said he had the right to deny service. He said it softly, but he did not bend. The Apache watched the creek. He mapped the pattern of riders who came sniffing at the edges of the property. He followed one set of prints into a dry wash and found a pile of stones that did not belong. Under it lay a small brass token stamped with a railroad mark. A signal. He left it where it was and moved on. Near the spring, he saw a coyote pause and study him with an intelligence that felt like a message. He remembered a campfire long ago and a story told by an elder about signs on the land that men forgot how to read. Then he heard something else. A whistle too soft for a machine and too sharp for a bird. He returned before dusk and told the woman what he had found. She listened with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. She said the sheriff had caught 2 men near the barn. She said the operator had warned of a freight car with rails and guards. He considered the map again, seeing more than lines now. He saw timing. He saw the way men moved when they had a plan they thought no one else understood. He told her to pack what she could not afford to lose into a crate that could travel quickly. Important papers. A small box of keepsakes. She asked if they would run. He said no. That night the town slept in patches. The telegraph key tapped late. The widow sat by her window with a kettle steaming to keep her child's cough from shaking. Him to pieces. The schoolteacher wrote by lamplight until her eyes hurt and then copied passages of law in a neat hand for the judge to see in the morning. The sheriff walked the main street and stopped twice to speak to an old man who had fought on both sides of 2 different disputes and learned to outlast fools with guns. The saloon went quiet before midnight for the first time in weeks. On the ranch, the woman sat on the steps and looked at the stars. She remembered a different sky in a different state, heavy with humidity and moths bumping against porch lamps. She remembered a man who had held her hand and believed their future could be measured in calves and seasons and the slow filling of a ledger with honest numbers. She felt that belief again, not as a memory but as a stubborn seed that refused to die. She looked at the barn, whole and dark, and thanked the sheriff without saying his name. A sound rose from the hills. Not the call of a night bird, not the scrape of a branch. A far rattle that had no place in the silence, rails moving. Men hauling iron in the dark where no one could argue. Another sound joined it, hooves on hardpan. Too many to be a family. Heading home late, the woman stood and set her cup down. The Apache stepped from the shadow of the cottonwoods before she could call his name. He had already heard what she was hearing now. The first rider crested the low ridge by the creek and lifted a lantern high. A reply came from the north side of the pasture, another lantern swinging. Then a third near the dry wash where the token lay buried under rock. The Apache laid a hand on the woman's arm, steady, not restraining. The lantern light shook with the wind and with the nerves of the man who held it. At the edge of the yard, the sheriff stepped from behind the woodpile with a quiet shape at his shoulder. The judge's clerk. He carried a folded paper and a face that looked older than it had that morning dot in the space between lantern lights and the dark. The land held its breath once more. The rival rancher was somewhere near, of that there was no doubt. The agent would not be far either. The rails would come, if not tonight then soon, and once they were set down they would be hard to lift again. The woman looked from the hills to the creek to the house she had kept standing with grit and prayer. She did not speak. The Apache did not speak. The sound of the lantern handles knocking against their frames marked the seconds. Something was about to be asked of them that would cost more than 30 days. The lanterns swayed in the night air like signals from another world, faint glows carried by men who thought they owned the darkness. The woman stood on the steps of her house with her hands clenched tight, the rough wood pressing into her palms. The Apache remained beside her, steady and silent, though his eyes were sharp and unblinking, fixed on the ridge where the first rider had shown himself. The sheriff shifted his weight near the woodpile, hand resting loose but ready at his belt. Beside him, the clerk clutched his folded paper so tight it crumpled at the edges. The paper was law, but out here law was fragile. What men brought in? Their hands, and what they were willing to do, often spoke louder than stamps or signatures. From the creek came the low sound of iron scraping against iron. The men were not only scouting with lanterns. They were moving rails in secret. The freight spur was being laid not in the day when the town might object, but in the dead of night when the earth itself seemed too tired to resist. The sound carried like a whisper of the future the agent had promised, a future that cut through the woman's land and left her with nothing but dust. The Apache finally moved. He stepped down from the cottonwoods, every stride calm, measured. The lantern light caught the edge of his face, but not his eyes. He walked to the woman's corral, checked the gate, then leaned against the post as if he were nothing more than a tired ranch hand watching the night pass. Yet every person present felt the weight of that simple gesture. It was a warning without words. The sheriff cleared his throat, low and steady, then spoke toward the ridge. He said the town was asleep and meant to stay that way. He said men who worked at night without calling on the judge or the council did so at their own risk. His voice did not rise, but it carried across the pasture with the authority of a man who had buried enough fools to know the cost of pride. For a long moment, no answer came. The lantern on the ridge swung, a nervous hand betraying nerves. Then a shout echoed back. The rancher's voice, smooth as oil but hard underneath. He said the rails were coming whether anyone liked it or not. He said progress was not a matter of choice. He said anyone who stood in its way would be moved, one way or another. The woman's heart thudded so loud she could barely hear the words. The Apache turned his head slightly toward her, enough for her to know he had heard more than just the voice. He was listening to the ground itself, the shuffle of hooves, the shift of men in the grass. She could see it in the tilt of his shoulders, in the way his hand brushed the worn wood of the gate. He was counting them, weighing them, already knowing what was about to unfold. The clerk stepped forward, his voice high but clear. He shouted that the deed still stood. He said the land was not open, the patent not yet dissolved, the papers not yet overturned. He waved the folded sheet like a flag of reason. A bullet cracked the night wide open and the paper flew from his hand. The lanterns jerked. Horses reared. The woman gasped as the clerk fell to his knees clutching his arm. The sheriff dropped to one side and pulled him to cover behind the woodpile, cursing under his breath. The shot had not been meant to kill. It had been meant to silence. The woman staggered back against the doorframe. The Apache did not move fast, but he moved with purpose. He walked to her side, put the folded paper back into her hand, and then stepped forward into the open yard where the lanterns could see him clearly. He raised one hand, palm outward, as if daring them to take another shot. The silence stretched until the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Then a voice called again from the ridge. The rancher told him to step aside. He said the land did not belong to the woman any longer. He said there was no place for an Apache in a town built for settlers and rails. The words cut sharp, but the Apache's hand did not waver. He spoke then, in a voice low yet carrying across the yard. He said the land was older than all of them. He said the spring had been drinking water before the first post had been driven into the soil. He said paper burned, but the earth remembered. His words rolled across the night, simple, unadorned, but filled with a certainty that no map could erase. The woman felt a chill as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. She saw the faces of the men who had followed the rancher, their lanterns, trembling. They had not expected words. They had expected fear or gunfire or retreat. Instead, they were given truth spoken plain. For a flicker of a moment, she thought they might lower their lights and ride away. But the rancher's laugh cut through her hope like a blade. He told them to keep moving the rails. He told them to ignore the old tailies and focus on what mattered. He promised them each a share of the freight contract if they stood firm tonight. The sound of iron scraping returned, louder now, deliberate. The freight spur was being set, inch by inch, over the bones of her life. The woman clutched the deed tighter, her knuckles white. She wanted to shout, to plead, to demand they stop. But her throat closed around the words. She looked to the sheriff, who crouched beside the injured clerk with his jaw tight. He was one man against many, and the law in his hand was worth less than the bullet already spent. He knew it. She knew it. The Apache turned his head and gave her a single look. It was not comfort. It was not a promise. It was a question silent, but clear. How far was she willing to go? Her breath caught, her heart stuttered. She thought of her husband's grave, the fence posts she had hammered with her own arms, the long nights praying for rain while wolves howled in the distance. She thought of how quickly it could all be swept away. The lanterns began to move again, spreading wider now, encircling. More hooves pounded from the north. Shapes shifted in the dark, shadows within shadows. The rancher was not content with rails alone. He had brought more men, more guns, enough to force her choice before dawn. The sheriff muttered something sharp under his breath and cocked his revolver. The clerk bit back a groan and pressed his sleeve against the wound. The woman's knees trembled, but she forced herself to stand straight, to keep her gaze fixed. On the ridge, the Apache finally dropped his hand. Slowly, with deliberate calm, he turned and walked back toward the porch. He did not retreat. He did not bow his head. He moved with the same steadiness he had shown the day she asked him for. 30 days. When he reached the steps, he stopped, planted his feet, and let the silence stretch until even the men on the ridge shifted in their saddles. He spoke once more, his voice as even as the beat of a drum. He said if they wanted to lay rails across this land tonight, they would have to step into the yard to do it. The challenge hung heavy in the night. Horses pawed at the dirt, riders exchanged looks, lanterns swung uncertainly. The rancher cursed, shouted for them to press on, but even his men hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to cross that invisible line. They knew the sheriff still had his gun. They knew the Apache did not bluff. And they knew the woman, standing there with the crumpled deed in her fist, might be more dangerous than any of them had guessed. The sound of rails being dragged grew slower, more hesitant. The night stretched tighter and tighter, every heartbeat a hammer against the ribs. The woman felt it in her bones, the sense that something had to break, that the world itself could not hold this tension much longer. She gripped the paper until it tore at the edges, until the ink smudged against her skin. Then, far off toward the east, a whistle cut the dark. Not a bird, not a rider, but the shrill cry of a train still miles away. The sound carried like a promise or a warning, reminding them all that progress was moving toward them faster than any of them could stop. The riders stiffened. The rancher shouted again. The sheriff raised his gun, and the woman felt the air snap like a bowstring pulled to breaking. The train's whistle echoed across the valley, long and piercing, and for a moment it felt as if the earth itself trembled. The riders shifted uneasily, lanterns wobbling in their hands, eyes darting between the ridge and the dark yard below. The rancher cursed at them to move, to drag the rails forward, but his voice cracked against the tension that had been wound. Too tight. The sheriff leveled his revolver with the calm of a man who had drawn far too many times before, and the Apache stood motionless, his presence more threatening than steel. The woman, clutching her torn deed in her fist, realized she was not waiting for someone else to decide her fate. It was hers to claim, or to lose. She stepped forward into the yard, her boots crunching on dry dirt, and her voice rang clear into the night. She told them the land was not for sale, not for trade, not for rails or promises or contracts whispered in smoky rooms. She told them her husband was buried here, that her blood and sweat had been poured into the soil, and that no paper carried to town in the pocket of a land agent could erase that. She told them she would not yield, not tonight, not ever. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the far cry of the train again, closer now, as though time itself was bearing down. Then the riders muttered among themselves. Some shifted back in their saddles, unwilling to be the first to press against a widow, a sheriff, and a man whose very stillness warned of danger. The rancher shouted at them, his temper slipping, his control fraying. He swung his arm, pointing his pistol at the Apache. Before he could fire, a second gun cracked. The sheriff's shot struck the dirt at the rancher's horse, sending the animal rearing. The rancher toppled backward, hitting the ground hard, his pistol skittering out of reach. For the first time, his men saw him not as the master of the moment, but as a man scrambling in the dirt. And in that instant, their loyalty wavered. One by one, the lanterns lowered. Some men turned their horses and rode toward the ridge. Others simply sat, caught between orders and the sudden truth that their leader had lost his grip. The Apache finally moved. He walked out into the yard with a quiet certainty and picked up the rancher's fallen pistol. He did not raise it. He simply held it, then tossed it into the dust at the sheriff's boots. His eyes never left the men on the ridge, and though he spoke no words, the message was plain. Leave now. The rancher scrambled up, his pride bleeding more than his body. He cursed them all, swearing the rails would come, swearing the town would. Regret siding with weakness. But when he called for his men again, fewer voices answered. The sheriff ordered him back into town to answer for the attack on the clerk. The rancher spat, but the fight was gone from his voice. Two of his closest hands pulled him to his horse, more out of duty than loyalty, and they retreated down the trail with shadows chasing them. The yard went quiet again, the night closing over the tension like a blanket. The woman's knees almost gave out, but she steadied herself with the torn deed still clutched in her hand. She looked at the Apache, who had returned to the gate, calm as if the storm had been nothing but weather passing. He met her gaze for a long moment, and though no words passed between them, she felt the weight of his presence settle deep inside her. A reminder that strength came in many forms. In the days that followed, the town spoke of what had happened in hushed tones that carried more respect than gossip. The judge, shaken by how close things had come, reviewed her deed again with the schoolteacher's carefully written notes at his side. He ruled that the land patent still held firm and that no new survey could overturn it without further review from the capital. The agent left town with his chain and his maps, swearing he would return, but fewer people believed him. The clerk, with his arm bandaged, told anyone who would listen that law meant nothing without people willing to defend it. He said the widow. And the Apache had shown more courage than any ledger. The sheriff agreed, though he said it in his own plain way, that sometimes a man needed to see where he would draw his line. The rival rancher lost face. Men who had once ridden at his side began to scatter, seeking wages elsewhere. The saloon no longer welcomed him, the mercantile refused him credit, and even the telegraph operator refused to send his messages without payment in full. Pride kept him from vanishing altogether, but he was no longer the force he had been. The land was safe, at least for now, though the sound of the distant railroad still carried on the wind.
The woman tended her ranch with a steadier hand. She patched fences, worked the corral, and walked the pasture at dusk with the memory of that night still sharp in her chest. She knew the fight was not over, that progress would return with heavier boots and larger claims, but she no longer felt like prey. She had stood her ground, and the town had seen it. More than that, she had learned that strength was not just in guns or laws, but in the courage to face the dark when it came to her door. The Apache stayed longer than 30 days. When she asked him why, he said the hills still spoke of men moving at night, and he did not yet trust the quiet. She accepted his presence without question. Sometimes they worked side by side without words, the rhythm of daily life carrying them through. Other times they sat near the fire, sharing silence that felt heavier than conversation. Slowly, the unease between them shifted into something like trust, forged not by promises but by what they had endured together. The subplots of the town found their place in the new order. The widow at the mercantile, once overlooked, became a voice people listened to, for she had seen the danger first and warned of it. The schoolteacher grew bold in council meetings, quoting law with the clarity of one who had studied long after. Candles burned low. The blacksmith, who had sharpened tools for neighbors in need, became known not just for his iron, but for his loyalty to the community. And the saloon owner, who had quietly taken a stand, found his business steadier as men, respected his quiet courage. The sheriff aged a little more after that night, though he never said so. He spent more time on the porch of his office, watching the horizon as if expecting the next storm. Yet when folks asked him about the night of the lanterns, he only said that people learned who they were when the dark pressed close. And he said, the town had passed its test. For the woman, life did not return to what it had been. It became something different. She still missed her husband, still felt the ache of loss in quiet moments, but she no longer felt that her story ended with grief. She had a ranch to tend, a future to guard, and the knowledge that even when the world pressed hard against her, she could stand. That night had proved it. The Apache never said if he meant to stay forever, but he stayed through the turning of the season, through the long heat and into the cooling winds of autumn. Whether he would leave when the hills called again was a question she did not ask. For now, his presence was part of the land, as much as the cottonwoods and the creek. The story spread, carried on whispers beyond the town. Some called it the night the rails were stopped. Others called it the night the widow and the Apache drew a line that progress could not cross. The truth was simpler. It was the night when fear met resolve, when men with lanterns learned that paper was not stronger than courage, and though the railroad still came in time, it bent its path just enough to leave her homestead untouched. The spur ran north, through ground the rancher once claimed, and the sound of its whistle passed the town each morning without tearing through the heart of her land. She would hear it and remember that night, the weight of the deed in her hand, the lantern swaying, the silence broken by her own voice refusing to yield. In the end, the land remained hers. The rancher faded into memory, the agent's threats turned hollow, and the town grew not by taking, but by holding firm to what mattered. She lived each day with the steady knowledge that she had not stood alone, and that even when storms came again, she would not meet them with silence. It was not just the story of a widow, or of an Apache, or of a single night when the air held its breath. It was the story of how courage could shape the course of lives, how dignity could outlast maps, and how strength could be found in places no one expected. And in the quiet that followed, as the rails sang far off and the sun set, over a land still wild, the woman felt something she thought she had lost long ago. She felt free.